even if you've got a group of, 5, 6 people within the department, it's going to take you a little bit of time to run through several of the processes and to ensure that people are somewhat competent, at least in understanding the process, knowing what's critical in the process and making sure that those things are being, really honed in.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
All right, Sterile Processing Universe, you're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, Season 28, Planet Decontamination. I'm your host, Babiy Parker. Joining me in studio today is
Hank Balch.
Hank, it is good to talk with you again this week. I feel like Mondays are the best day of the week now in this job.
Yeah. There's nothing like getting dirty on a Monday, right? We're gonna be getting dirty, fighting dirty on today's episode. Talking about, yes, I know, you're like, another conversation about IFUs. I get it. It is worth talking about, so we don't want to undermine that frustration that's out there, the irritation, the true risk. Yes, it is. But we do want to add a new level of insight and perspective on this ongoing challenge today. We're going to do so with just a tremendous guest to help us out.
Yeah, as we asked the question, is IFU compliance even achievable? I remember an article that you had written on LinkedIn a long time ago, Hank, just talking about the impossibility of IFU compliance, and it can certainly feel that way. So as we talk, we'll keep pressing into some solutions here and try to help you tackle some of that impossibility. So lots to come. Hang with us. We'll be right back.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
And joining us now in studio is Art Babiy, sterile processing consultant out there on the West Coast. Art, thanks for joining us in the studio. Good to see you again.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
And yeah, for sure. And Art, you've been a longtime friend of the show. I think you've joined us for a podcast episode or two. But for those who are maybe new to the app, new to the show, and aren't familiar with you, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and why this topic of IFU compliance is really important to you?
Absolutely. So I've been in the industry for 20 years, healthcare just in general, about 10 years in sterile processing. And, I've really grown and enjoyed sterile processing from the get-go. It just was like a hand in glove fit type of thing. And one of the things that I really just enjoy in sterile processing, just an overlook, is the, individuals there empowering teams and creating, just the culture around sterile processing and just different individuals and developing individuals. Those of you who don't know, I do have 5 kids, 2 boys, 3 girls, been married for 15 years. I've been on the road since 2018. And one of the things that, really, across the board in my travels, the conversation around IFUs, different departments, and how do we take one IFU and apply it across, 4,000 different hospitals. And I think some of the things that we've run into and have been doing is just, it's a huge challenge, I think, industry wide, but hopefully we discuss some of those solutions today.
Yeah, Art, as we were chatting on the call before we hit record, you in many ways are one of those kind of rare specimens. You've got this big family of 7 moving across the country from contract to contract. You said my home is where my work is. And I kind of struggle to imagine what that would be like for my family. But one thing that came across through that conversation is just your love for this industry and your love for what you do. I appreciate that about you, that your passion for device reprocessing is keeping you guys on the road and happy while you do it. So this conversation around IFU compliance is an important one. Teased in the intro that we're kind of preaching to the choir here, talking about IFUs. I think IFU shows up in just about every episode that we record at Beyond Clean. But in another sense, when you get down to the nitty gritty of how do you actually apply this IFU knowledge, where the rubber meets the road in Decontam with the technician at the sink, like how do we tackle actually getting this done? And that's what we want to dive into today. So as we jump right into this, Art, could you tell us a little bit about these IFU requirements? What should we expect to find in these IFUs? And I guess more particularly, why is it so important that we follow this very complex piece of paper in decontamination? Why are we required to have IFUs?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our industry, this is pretty basic knowledge. I feel like everybody understands that IFUs outline the reprocessing, at least for sterile processing, of instrumentation. And from what I understand, IFUs are built to pass certain FDA requirements for the way that the instrument is being reprocessed to ensure it's safe to use on patients. So there's a lot of regulation that's required on the manufacturer side to qualify and be used within the industry. And the challenge that I feel we all come across day in and day out with the IFUs is that it's pretty much a blanket statement for all different types of hospitals, environments, individuals, processes, and you're trying to create one document that's going to do that for everybody. And I think that's where we run into 99% of our problems. And not having standardization around that just really, really hangs us up.
Well, and similar to that one document for all places, sometimes it's one document for all instruments too, those blanket IFUs that cover an entire line of instruments. And sometimes the interpretation question of, well, it says that this thing's supposed to be open all the way. Like how disassembled are we going to go with this instrument? So there's some challenge on that front as well. Touching one more thing on this requirements piece, like, am I going to go to jail if I don't follow an IFU? Like how much weight do these carry in our department?
So when we have regulatory agencies like JCO and, state regulatory agencies that come through, they're going to look at what is the process that we follow for our instrumentation. And they're going to look at those. And that's what that kind of outlines what is or isn't required for a process. But I think more than anything else is that are these instruments, are these processes that we're following, are they just tribal knowledge, or is it something that's really been tested to ensure that this is safe to use on, our family members, our communities, and just individuals in the ORs. So I think that's really what we're trying to provide, is that safe to use environment for our patients with outcomes that are going to be good for everyone, especially the patient.
Right. Yeah, Babiy, to your question, I don't know if I've ever seen a sterile processing technician handcuffed walking out of the hospital due to skipping the cleaning step.
But there is this regulatory weight that comes along with it because it's the FDA. This isn't AMI. It's not a guideline. It's a regulatory requirement, and there are legal consequences to the hospital accepting that risk of not following what the manufacturer puts out there. So it's a big deal.
But FDA doesn't regulate the hospital, right? So FDA doesn't regulate sterile processing or the hospital, and so the regulation weight of IFUs, and this is where it's really bringing us to the crux of the disconnect, right? The weight of the regulatory pressure is on manufacturers to get this validated to Art. That was a perfect description that you gave. This has been tested. This has been validated, per the manufacturer's requirements through the FDA. But then once it gets into the hospital setting, it's actually not outside of, passing your Joint Commission survey, your Department of Health survey, which, they're looking to see, are you compliant with the IFU? the primary application at the hospital is let's not get sued. Because it's not the FDA that's going to sue them. It's going to be an attorney that says, hey, the manufacturer had guidelines for how this thing's been validated to be cleaned. This hospital didn't follow them, and therefore now they're open to a lawsuit. Now, good news, and we talked about this on another episode, I've also never heard of an individual sterile processing tech getting sued. And a personal injury attorney will tell you it's because they're not the ones that have the money. So plaintiffs are going to sue people who have the money. And the people who they sue are the hospital, the surgeon, and the original equipment manufacturer, the OEM, which brings all of these IFUs right back to the very center of it. So I know you didn't ask me that question, Babiy, but I want to weigh in on that piece because I have an opinion about it.
Well, it's somewhat tongue in cheek, but I appreciate that clarification.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think what you're saying, it goes to the heart of the issue is that that's another big problem in IFUs is that organizations are thinking liability instead of, hey, how do we get this so that it makes sense? How do we do this for ease of process or ease of, application and process? It's more of, well, how do I cover my, in making sure that if somebody comes back after me, it's not my liability type of thing. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, so we've talked a little bit about the requirement piece, right? And I think we can do a whole episode on just why we should follow why these different entities want us to follow this IFU piece. But in the interest of getting as many of these check marks off today as we can, I want to move on to the IFU layout piece. And so this is when you pull up an IFU and you look at it, what are you seeing? And talk me through that. Are you seeing the same thing when you pull up any IFU? If not, why not? And what are you seeing specific again to this decontamination portion of the IFU?
Sure. So a lot of IFUs, first of all, you're going to be scrolling for a while trying to find the sterile processing portions of IFUs because they tend to be a ways down. It's, you're flipping through what I think average IFUs 10 to 20 pages long, and it's, fine print, nothing super exciting. And so you're scrolling and you're trying to figure out what applies to you, what applies to your department. A lot of them are hit and miss as far as, giving you a specific process. Unfortunately, not much of an outline. And I think that we're going to touch on this a little bit later, but hard to interpret a lot of times too. But looking for basic stuff makes it a little bit challenging. And I think that, again, further on, we'll touch on some tools that I feel like exist today that are being applied in different areas. But it definitely is a challenge to, go to, especially in Decontam. If you're in Decontam, you've got your PPE on, access definitely becomes a problem.
Yeah, that's where I want to go next is accessing these things at the point of need. However, I do want to call out your point about the fine print and the multi-pages. We just cannot say this enough. If these IFUs are written just to check an FDA compliance box and not to actually effectively and safely communicate these instructions to the user, then what the heck are we doing, guys and gals? Like, what the heck? These documents are supposed to help us do our jobs. And if we can't read them and we can't find what we need easily, they're just completely missing the boat. All right, dead horse, and I'm done kicking that. But on the access piece, you alluded to PPE, right? And this goes to the title of this episode, the IFU Memory Maze. Is it our expectation, Art, that every sterile processing technician that clocks in every decontamination area in every department around the globe, when they clock in, if they have every decontamination step and IFU of every instrument in their inventory completely memorized so that no matter what comes through their decontamination area, they know exactly what to rinse, how long to rinse, what to brush, what to actuate, how to inspect, How long to ultrasonic? Is that our expectation? And if so, how are we accessing these IFUs in that moment?
I got one word for you, Neuralink. Elon Musk, right?
Okay, so for anyone who's not familiar with what that is, I know that was tongue in cheek, but I think that's interesting. So tell us what that is.
So Neuralink, something Elon Musk's working on, is where it's a implant into your brain with, I think they're up to 256 little wires that go directly into your brain that then interface with a computer. I think the most recent one, I saw someone who has, no ability to move their arms or legs is able to play video games. And I think it was a first person shooting game that he was playing, and like he was just knocking it out of the park. There's just no competition to, somebody who's controlling it with their hand and somebody that's controlling it with their head, which was quite surprising to me to see how far along they are. But that's not the case. And we're not uploading IFUs to the brain yet. So back to kind of what you were saying, I think, no, that obviously is not the expectation. And currently what we're doing is we're using tools. In SPD, we have tracking systems that, some better, some worse, but in general, a digital copy of it with the instrument IFU at least attached to the instrument in the system is extremely helpful. There's systems out there that have what they call one source, that has an archive of IFUs. And if you pre-program that into your tracking system, if you have the ability to do so, you have it at the fingertips of your technicians. Now, having said that, because we're specifically talking about Decontam, and the accessibility of that within Decontam still is a little bit of a challenge, because some of the systems that I've seen across the board, it's a little bit harder in Decontam because you're not necessarily going instrument by instrument. You've got just a general set that you're looking over, and you're not checking every instrument off. So there's a little bit more challenge there, I think, to try to dive in and have every single IFU within the system. So a lot of times it's, we're covering the IFUs by continuous education. I think that's a big part of it, and ensuring, that we have our teams educated. And if there's a new product that's coming in or a new item, giving SPD that lead time to ensure that we have the time to train individuals, understand the process, and cross-train. I'm not exactly sure what an average SPD department is, but even if you've got a group of, 5-6 people within the department, it's going to take you a little bit of time to run through several of the processes and to ensure that people are somewhat competent, at least in understanding the process, knowing what's critical in the process and making sure that those things are being, really honed in.
Yeah. Art, you say that it's not the expectation to memorize all of these IFUs, and in one sense we would all agree and say that that's an inhuman task to be able to keep all of that in your head at the same time. At the same time, it kind of is the expectation in a lot of places because of the access problem you talked about. So we offer that training, those in-services. We create workflows where we try to design a process that all of our instruments will kind of fit through. So as long as you stay with the process, the IFUs are being met. And Art, I suspect if you and I were to walk together into any sterile processing department in the US here and ask them, like, what area of your department is the busiest, where you have the least amount of time to go looking up something in the computer, and we're going to get the unanimous answer, Decontam, right? And so there's this access problem because you can't be thumbing through a file folder full of papers in dripping wet gloves in decontamination. But there's also a time component to this as well, of being able to go back to the computer and access a library and pull up the IFU for a drill every time that they're processing it. So I'm curious, from your travels, from your experience in the department, how do we go about applying what is written in those IFUs to the activity that happens at the sink? Access is one thing. Maybe you put a computer in the department, give them that digital library to get to when they need it. But how do you actually apply that IFU language to the activity happening at the sink?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the solutions that I've seen and I've come across, mostly are digital, so it's going to require some investment on the facility side, and it really is to integrate the IFU one into process, just like we spoke about earlier, but to be able to reference the process and the IFU in conjunction with the process, and that can be built into the workflows of different tracking systems. And I think for me, from where we are as far as technological advances in sterile processing, I think that's the greatest asset right now that we have, is to really lean into our tracking systems and be able to attach those specific instructions at the area of the process. For instance, we use SPM here, and my knowledge of SPM, I mean, I've worked with it more than I have with any other software, tracking system software. And I mean, they allow for you to integrate messages and different, like you could literally scan an instrument to a point and it'll tell you, hey, this is the first step, this is the second step, this is the third step. And it literally, you create a workflow within that scan point. And that's I think that really is the solution, because for you to move on to the next process, you have to follow that next step. And once you're done, the workflow is complete, you go to the next thing, and it doesn't slow you down, because you're still moving through stuff just as quickly as you would, because you're following these steps. And I think for me, and from what I've seen, that has to be one of the tools we just really try to utilize and just bring into our departments for sure. And that's our tracking systems. The digital, I just don't see it any other way.
Are you saying that you're utilizing those workflows today for these decontamination steps and processes? Is that what I heard you say?
No. You didn't hear me say that. I'm saying that's where I think the solution is. Now, I think that we do some of especially the more intense, lengthy processes. I think that we do utilize that, but I think on simpler instruments, it's not as big of an issue. So we're not creating, workflow processes for things that, our basic instrumentation. We're not going to sit there and, write out a whole workflow for that. But for instance, Da Vinci arms, right? That's a process, and it's lengthy if you're not doing it every day. And if you're not, because you have different areas of decontam or whatnot, to get somebody to make sure that we're following every process and make sure that there's accountability too. That's another big part of, IFUs, is to ensure, hey, we can create a process, we can do all this stuff, but if we can't say, hey, who decontamed this, because we found blood in the instrument in the OR, and we can't say, hey, this individual, we can't come back to the individual and say, hey, why did you skip a step, right? Where we can see that. And I think that's where that digital tracking system is going to be, paramount to.
The nights, Babiy, this is how we started, back in the day. It'd be like 3 people back in decon, but only one person's logged in and scanning. So it's just like, hey, Hank, there's a dirty that came through, and it's like, well, might have been me, might have been Johnny, might have been Babiy. Who knows? Nobody knows, because it was just one scan. Right. So, like getting to the specifics that you were describing, I think a couple of answers ago, what you called out in the ways that our IFUs are integrated in decon at the tray level, but not at the instrument level. I think that's one of the most important takeaways of this entire interview, because that's not the way that many of the IFUs are written, especially with these unique instruments. Back to kind of what Babiy said, it's not a tray, but 100% Aesculap general instruments for the most part. There may be Aesculap instruments, there may be V. Mueller instruments, there may be a specialty Keras and Rangeur that's put in there. And if you're not drilling down instruction-wise or workflow-wise to those unique instruments with the more complex IFUs, and they're just being treated like every other standard instrument, like whatever status quo workflow is set in your decon, that's where we get all this non-compliance. So I just want to call that out. That's a really important statement that you made. And I think it's one of the keys, to fixing this problem at the local level. But secondarily, I really appreciate that you called out how to better integrate with and utilize your tracking system. That's an unspoken but pretty well known issue within the industry, that we spend a lot of dollars on these high powered tracking systems and we use like 10% or 20% of the capabilities. Not because we don't necessarily want to. It's usually because we don't have the time, or we don't have that super user expertise. And they also don't have the time to do it. And so we're left with just like the surface level capabilities of these tracking systems that many times can solve down to the detail level that you're talking about. That was a long kind of monologue to get to my next question here, Art, which is the accountability piece that you brought up, because that is also critical. Whatever the solution is, whatever the tracking, the process, the training, the education, if you've got them all memorized, if you've got the NeuroLink, that's great. You knew what to do. How do we get to documentation that you did what you knew what to do, and that it's tied to the instrument, to the workflow, to the tray? Talk us through, like, is that possible today? How close can we get? What are the steps to get there? You can start anywhere you want to.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a real point of contention and failure a lot of times in facilities, is that how do we document this? You're not going to be, just like we talked a little bit earlier, you're not going to have a bunch of paperwork sitting there checking stuff off. So how do we make this work? So I think, again, it goes back to, ensuring that we have a tracking system, a way to digitally track these things. A huge part of that is, key dots, making sure that we're tracking individual instruments that have, extra steps. If we have vendor trays with, unique IFUs, we need to make sure that they're all unique, but things that are outside the normal brushing, flushing, and, washing, if they have, extensive steps that we need to make sure we're following, add those in for the techs within, so that when they, scan that instrument, there's an instruction, hey, focus on this, pay attention to this. And when you click, the system, it sees who's clicking what scans are being made. And that enables for that, trackability for the department to see who's performing what tasks, or at least saying they're performing, maybe they're not, and they're just clicking through stuff. So you have that accountability and documentation. And that's huge. I feel like if you've got a tracking system and it's not doing that for you, you got to be looking for something else. But in general, I feel like that's where the answer really lies. It's being able to create those scan points for individuals. And I think that there comes also another factor in this, is scan fatigue, where you're scanning a lot of things. But the thing is, the more you scan, the more data, the system's able to provide. And I'm kind of segue into the next point of this, but, with AI where it is, being able to integrate these tracking systems into allowing us, hey, these are some of the issues, analyzing this data in the tracking systems to show, hey, showing the big picture, show the sterile processing departments, crunching that data for them and showing them what's going on in the department, what is being followed, what isn't being followed. When you see that somebody did a tray in Decontam, it took them all of 25 seconds, there's something wrong, and ensuring that we're following those things up. I think another key factor is, audits, regular audits, to make sure that that's something that's being done. It might be clicked on, it might be, digitally it's documented, but when you start looking at your audits, you're like, wait, hold on, this doesn't look quite right, and that goes to another conversation where we need in-house educators. We need somebody that's going to be assigned to doing these types of things. And I think that a lot of times hospital systems look at the number of cost of, an educator, or, hey, a tracking system is going to cost us this much, but what's the cost of not having those things? And I think that we forget to realize what that looks like. I've been to a facility where, we delayed cases, and the cost of what OR time is just crazy. And, you spend 2 to 5 hours waiting for stuff to be turned over. That's a cost. And I think that that's something that isn't being looked at. So what's the cost of not doing these things, right?
Yeah. It's often joked about in sterile processing departments that keeping up with the IFUs would be a full-time job. Like, we would need to pay somebody just to make sure we have the right ones in the department. But But everything that you talked about, from the auditing through even setting up these workflows in our decontamination room, all of that falls into leadership responsibilities. It's an untenable ask to have an IFU posted on the wall or a pop-up in your tracking system for every single instrument in decontamination because of that click fatigue you mentioned. We're just kind of clicking through things to try to get the work done because it's an impossible amount of information being thrown at them. So what you've got to get to is having a process as you bring new instruments into the facility and review the ones that you have in your facility to try to design and create workflows and then figure out how to get that information in front of technicians. And I liked your call out about AI being a solution to help with that someday in the future. We talk about the advancement of robotics and technology and how sometimes that's scary to think about in sterile processing. But what we're really after is how do we take away those menial, repetitive tasks of clicking to try to bring up the right IFU? What if there was a computer vision thing that knew that you were cleaning that particular model of scope and it just delivered the steps to you as you were working without you having to interface with that computer? Those types of solutions sound very achievable with the technology that exists today. So definitely a lot to think about. I appreciate that flurry of exhortations that you gave to our leaders about how to try to get their hands around this, even if they don't have a tracking system in place today, auditing the workflow, getting involved in IFUs, all of that. So we're trying to wrap up all of that into one closing here, Art. We are about out of time. So I'll give you the last word here. If there was one takeaway that you wanted for our listeners out in the sterile processing world to take away from trying to tackle the IFU memory maze, what would it be?
I think that we want our technicians to feel that this isn't just, individuals. It's not just individual departments. This is a national, if not an international issue, and that you're not alone. Don't be afraid to go out there, talk to other individuals, reach out to your SPD community. We're all in this fight together in more ways than one, and that there are tools out there. Even if you don't have tracking systems, I've seen individuals implement, QR codes for YouTube videos, and things like that, where you can be at your, at point of reprocessing and scan that specific item, and then it'll show you how to go from A to B or whatever it is. So there's definitely solutions out there. So hopefully nobody feels that it can be overwhelming, but don't feel overwhelmed. I know it's easier said than done, but there's definitely solutions out there. So I think that if anything, keep chipping away at it and, reach out for help for sure.
There you have it. Keep on keeping on. We have not said all there is to say about this topic by a long shot. And so if this has brought up any further questions that you wanted to reach out to Art and talk through, I would encourage you to find him on LinkedIn, very active on that platform. I'm sure he would love to chat with you there. And Art, I want to say thanks for joining us for another fantastic episode. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, you guys.
And that was Art Babiy, sterile processing consultant, talking to us about the IFU memory maze and these wild expectations we have of our technicians in decontamination. Hank, when we talked about scheduling this interview, one of the things we wanted to do was to avoid creating another piece of IFU complaint material out there, because there certainly is enough of that, and really try to help us think through how do we move the needle a little bit towards compliance. And I thought Art had some really helpful leadership tasks, particularly there at the end, for us to start thinking through and checking off to get this information from the IFU books into decontamination in one way or another.
Yeah, two things I want to say about that, Bobby. Number one, to add into that documentation piece, going back even to the legal risk part of the conversation we talked about at the beginning, is competencies. Like, we treat competencies sometimes as unconnected to these individual decisions as a tracer coming through. It's like high level education that we want to check off. People generally know how to do that, but you really need to have instrument level competence, like what it says to actuate this device underwater. Do we know that our people know what that means and what that looks like and how to do it in a standardized process? And is that integrated, to this process documentation piece? Because if I'm an attorney, I'm going and I'm looking, hey, did they document compliance? Yes, they did. Great. They say that they did it. Now I'm going straight to the competency piece and saying, were they competent? Because if they weren't competent, even if they did it, boom, doesn't matter. I'm bringing it to the jury, and here we go. That's number one. So it's really, really important to tie those two together. Number two, just January of 2025, Dr. Peter Nickel, if you know that name, if you've been listening to Beyond Clean for any amount of time, he just dropped a new journal article in the Journal of Perioperative Care and Operating Room Management, and it's on mapping the flexible endoscope disinfection cycle. So this is decontamination and disinfection. He goes through all the steps that are required for disinfecting endoscopes, and then he aligns different risk factors for each one of those steps, like the brushing, like the filling the sink, like the transportation piece, like the leak testing, like the detaching the attachments, all those kinds of things. He's drilling down into these various steps and then talking about not only the risk that's associated with it, but also the stressors. So like we're talking IFU application compliance and knowledge on this interview, but then there's a whole other aspect of it. If you skip one of these steps, what's the risk and what are the stressors that are constantly pushing against us as we're trying to go through and be compliant on this? So we're going to attach that PDF to this episode. So if you're listening in the mobile app, you can download the bonus content to check out that new article from Dr. Nickel.
Yeah, that risk error score that he talks about in there brings into play the question, even if we did have on the wall all the steps to the IFU right in front of our technician, in front of that complex device, the stressors that are present in that decontamination space are still going to lead to errors. Even if they know what the right thing is to do and they're highly motivated to do the right thing, there's still a human error component. So lots more work to be done around this topic of safe decontamination. We mentioned time so many times on this episode of our technicians don't have the time to get to these IFUs. And maybe that's an area that we need to think about as well. What can we be doing to try to buy some time for these technicians to focus on the important task of cleaning? We love hearing from our listeners around the topics that we are talking through. So if you have a process, an idea, or something that's revolutionized your decontamination workflow with respect to IFUs, we would love to hear from you. You can reach us by email at info@beyondclean.net. That's going to do it for today's episode. So on behalf of Hank and myself, we'll say to you, as we always do until we talk to you next time, keep fighting dirty.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.